Both of those claims are based on knowledge of some kind. And so I think that the primary objection that people would have to the second one, that Christianity is the only true religion, or is that is a claim to an area of knowledge that either A, I can't justify, or B, no one can know that and the answer to that question, right? Or there is not an answer to that question. And so, in fact, this was probably like 10 years ago. The group here at the time hosted, the Reasonable Faith chapter here hosted an event on campus that was something like, come grill the Christians, or come roast the Christians, or something like that. And there was like a panel of us. It was me, Alan, and a few, in fact, Steve Lee was there that night, who I think Steve's coming up, maybe, is he next week? Yeah. There might have been some other folks here locally. I can't remember who all was there, but I remember when Alan pitched this idea, and I thought to myself, okay, man, UT Dallas, that's like an engineering school. I need to really bone up on science. I need to really, I was trying to guess, like, what kinds of questions am I going to be hit with, right? And the group actually that came was like so large that they split us into two different groups. There's like we split it into two different panels in two different rooms. And at the very beginning, a gal stood up, a young lady stood up and said, her very first question, she said, I think we can all agree that no one here really knows anything. Like, that was the very first thing. It's what we're talking about tonight. And her idea is that you can have your opinions about theology, about religion, about moral ethics, but no one knows. And another reason why I remember that gal is that she was wearing some kind of a weird cat costume hoodie thing. She was a quite interesting character. But I was just taken aback, like, wow, this is all about epistemology. This has nothing to do with science here. Like, all these questions are about this topic. And so, actually, some of what I'm going to share tonight might be geared more towards Christians in the audience. Sometimes when I come and give a talk here, it's a bit more apologetic in nature, so it might be for anybody. Not that if you're not a Christian, you won't get anything out of the talk, but I really do want to kind of target it at fellow believers in the room or here online. Actually, let's do something. Promise this isn't a sermon, but let's open, if you have a Bible app on your phone, let's pop that open real quick, or a Bible. Let's go to 2 Corinthians real quick. I want to read something together. 2 Corinthians, and we're going to go to 2 Corinthians 10, starting in verse 3. 2 Corinthians 10, starting in verse 3. I'm reading from the ESV, but it doesn't matter what you got there. All right, let me read this. For though we walk in the flesh, we're not waging war according to the flesh. That is, we're not using the weapons of this world. We're not using, and maybe this time, swords, spears. Now we're not talking about, guns or missiles. We don't walk in the flesh. We're not waging war according to the flesh. Verse 4, for the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but have divine power to destroy strongholds, or your translation might say fortress. And here's what a stronghold or a fortress is, verse 5. We destroy arguments and every lofty opinion, or another translation might say pretension, that is raised against not the power of God, but the knowledge of God. And we take every thought captive to obey Christ. So here, Paul is setting out some teaching on spiritual warfare, and I don't know that our churches always do a great job of pointing out that a great deal of spiritual warfare is the war of ideas. So specifically, a fortress or a stronghold is any thought or idea that's raised against the knowledge of God. And so tonight we're going to take on directly a stronghold that I think our culture is very much taken by. So there are, I think, three primary worldviews that are presently in conflict. Number one, not surprisingly, is theism. Obviously, I'm arguing for Christian theism, but I think theism more broadly, that there is a God. He has ordered the universe. that objective moral values and duties are part of his divine nature. And so when we align ourselves to the good, we are aligning ourselves according to his nature and the decrees that come from that. There is truth to be found. Truth is found in the sciences, in nature, but it is also found in other areas. Moral knowledge, metaphysical knowledge. I'll talk more about what I mean by that. And moral knowledge, and then ethical knowledge. And so that's theism. Second, which if you had asked me maybe like 10, 15 years ago, like even when I was preparing for that Hey, Grill the Christians event, I was thinking I'm probably going to bump into this more at UT Dallas than I am anything else. And I think a lot of apologetics, especially, you think like a William Lane Craig or, someone like that, a J.P. Moreland, maybe not so much more recently, but a lot of apologetics is geared towards scientific naturalism or atheism, right? Is there a God? That sort of a thing. And so scientific naturalism came out, birthed in the Enlightenment, came through the modernist period, and it's basically the view that, hey, there is knowledge, there is an objective reality, but that the only areas that you can know something are if they're quantifiable scientifically. So if we can run an experiment, then we can gain knowledge, right? And so sometimes that's called verificationism or scientism. And maybe you guys have talked about that here before, but I think that's a competing worldview, and it was probably more dominant, especially around like when the new atheists came, the quote unquote new atheists, they're old atheists now, for at least for as young as you guys are, they're like coming out like early 2000s, mid 2000s, circa like right around, like they really became popular after 9/11. And so these are folks like Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins and Dan Dennett and these kind of folks, right? They were advocating scientific naturalism. And I feel it was really in vogue, I think, at the time. But like brewing under the surface has been this one for some time. And I think it's actually now the primary dominant cultural worldview that it's presently in conflict with Christian theism. And I've got a couple words here, but I've titled it Postmodern Relativistic Neo-Marxism, and I know that's a lot of caveats, but I was pretty selective with my words here, and partly because, in that order, postmodernism comes first. It's a movement that rejects that there is truth. It's a movement that asserts that truth is relative to the person, morals are relative to the person. So it is fundamentally relativistic. The relativistic also has a very like internal self-focus, right? Like it's about my lived experience. It's about my psychology. Like that's what the real is, right? So if I say, hey, this is my lived experience, how can you argue with my lived experience, right? Neo-Marxism is the form that it has taken in a couple different areas, obviously politically, but also in the devising and the group, like the assigning identity to people in groups, not as individuals, right? So think, for Marx, that was economic, right? That was the proletariat, then it moved maybe towards like race. Maybe it was white, black, or now, obviously, it's like it might be something sexual in nature, like your sexual preference or your gender or fill in the blank, right? And so it's about identifying people in groups. So think like identity politics would fall under this. I think anytime you're doing like, you're talking about equity and inclusion, you're getting really close to like putting people into groups. So we're not like Martin Luther King, who said, no, we're going to judge people by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. Like, no, we're like all black people need to think this way, right? Or all black people are going to vote this way. All white people are associated with this, or we're not individuals, not being judged on our content or our character. We're judged by the group that we belong to. So if I get it all right, I'm a cisgendered evangelical male, right? So that's my group. So I fit into everybody's being categorized into groups. We're not being considered as individuals, right? This is the neo-Marxist thing. Marx is all about creating groups, dividing people, and then creating wars against the division. That was how you got Marxism started. Is you need to first create a divide, and then you need to create the war between the divide. And I would say we see that in our culture. This is what's happening. So these are the worldviews. I think that let's see. One thing to notice too is that I think for the postmodern relativistic person, they're very much, this is about your own human autonomy, which is really kind of what Greg Koukl calls kind of the prime heresy, like the very first one, that in the garden the snake says, did God really say? And so the temptation there is God in control, or should I seek my own autonomy from God? Should I be the creator of my reality? Or am I subject to an objective reality, right? And so I think this is very much a part of this postmodern relativistic worldview. So, all right, let's get let's talk through a couple things. We have because of this conflict, we have a massive problem with knowledge, okay? And we'll define some terms here in a minute. But I'm guessing you guys have heard something like this, right? You've heard people say, my truth. Anytime you hear the my truth, it should be like nails on a chalkboard if you hear that, because it's like, that is someone who has swallowed this relativistic postmodern view that truth is somehow subjective only to me. So you and I have different lived experiences. I have my own narrative, you have your own narrative. Like my narrative, my story, like that kind of language is really all about, it's about me creating my own truth, right? This is another one that if you're going to claim that objective truth is real, like there is an objective truth, regardless of your personal feeling, story, or narrative, whatever, there is a reality and a truth out there. That is viewed as being oppressive or evil, oftentimes, depending on what the claim is. And I do think this is primarily the underlying reason why someone like a Charlie Kirk stirs up so much strife, because he's claiming, like, you may disagree with me, but there is an objective truth. Well, that's considered like a moral evil, right? Who are you to say that you know something? What gives you the right? Right? This is another line that you might hear. You might bump into total apathy. Who cares? Like, why does the truth even matter? Like, who cares? That's one I've certainly heard. We've already talked about, hey, everything's relative, everything's subjective. That's true for you. It's not true for me. This is a big one. We should be tolerant or affirming of others. In other words, don't claim that you know something because you're going to invalidate, you're going to be intolerant towards this other group that disagrees with you. And so tolerance has shifted to mean something along the lines of agreeing or affirming with another person, right? If you think about what that word tolerate means, like the only way I can tolerate your view is if I think that you're wrong. If I didn't think you were wrong, I wouldn't tolerate your view, I would agree with you, right? But for me to tolerate your view, I have to fundamentally be in disagreement, but allow for the space for us to argue. It's your opinion. It's not like I'm going to force you, or you have freedom of thought, freedom of speech, right? So I'm going to tolerate your view, but it doesn't mean that I have to affirm your view. This is a really big one. In order to know something, you have to be certain. Like I don't want to. People will be. Oh, I don't want to say that I know that. I mean, I'm not 100% sure that that's true, right? And so they think of it as like a binary decision. It's like you're either 100% certain or you're not, and so you don't know it. That's not how knowledge works. Knowledge comes in degrees. There's certain things that I have more confidence, or certain beliefs and thoughts that I have more confidence in, right? So I might say something like, I know that God exists pretty high. I have pretty high confidence in that one. I know that Jesus rose from the dead, high, but probably a little lower. I feel like I have more evidence that God exists than I do that he rose from the dead. But I think I have good evidence, and so therefore I do know that. I do believe that. I know that to be true. Now, I could be wrong, and we'll get into that, right? Like, do you have knowledge if you could be wrong? We'll talk about that here in a second. but I don't have to be certain. I just need to be more than 50%. If I'm thinking about 0 to 100, like it comes in degrees. If I'm more than 50% sure, then it's an item of knowledge, but I may have varying degrees of belief or evidence or justification. Just from the fact that people have different opinions, that maybe that people might use that as an argument, like, hey, how can we really know things? People just have differing opinions on a particular subject. And then sometimes you might run into like extreme skepticism about everything. I mean, these are the people, the world is a simulation people. Or like, we're living in the Matrix. Like, how do you know we're not in the Matrix, or we're not in everything? That's like extreme skepticism. I think that I run into that sometimes too. All right. What is truth? So let's dive into a couple definitions. So what do I mean by truth? Well, who wants to take a stab at it? Have you guys talked about this already? Like, how would you define what truth is? This is the participation part of the lecture. What is truth?
That which corresponds to reality.
Oh, look at Mr. Philosophical textbook over here. Truth is a correlation that exists when my thoughts or my belief correctly correspond or accurately correspond to reality. So truth is the relation. That is what truth is. My thoughts don't make a truth. Reality makes truth, right? And so when I have the thought or the belief that accurately corresponds to reality, that's what truth is. And so this is a pretty standard and accepted definition for truth. Of course, there are other ones. They're just, this is by far the best. I would say Scripture also doesn't teach that directly, but as you read it, it assumes the correspondence view of truth. All right, what is knowledge? Knowledge is a justified or warranted true belief or true thought. Okay, you might be thinking, what the heck does justified or warranted mean? No worries. This is what that means. Justified or warranted means you have sufficient evidence for a belief. The belief was formed in a reliable way, and that your intellectual sensory faculties were functioning properly when the belief was formed. These are the three criteria that most philosophers would agree would provide justification for knowledge. Okay? So now you're going to have we're going to talk about different types of knowledge here in a second, and we'll talk about some examples of justification and warrant, different types of justification and warrant. Sometimes those words are used interchangeably. Obviously, this is like a intro to epistemology. So like, I mean, you could take an entire course. I mean, you could do a PhD in this. So there's no way I could cover everything for you guys, right? This is kind of a quick overview. So any questions so far on the correspondence definition of truth and what knowledge is? No? All right. There are three types of knowledge typically discussed. One is knowledge by direct awareness, and so that would be typically formed by some form of your senses, not just your physical senses, but I would also argue your mental faculties as well. You can sense things mentally that are in a non-physical way. But this chair has a couple different shades of green in it, and so I have direct knowledge that there is green on that chair in front of me. I don't have an argument for that. I don't have a syllogism that leads to, aside from I see green. That's my argument. I'm being appeared to greenly, as philosophers might say. That is, I have direct awareness, okay? This will come up here in a second. We'll talk about direct awareness and different, that's the easiest example though, of direct awareness. Skill, ability, or know-how, this is a little bit different form of knowledge, like it's the ability or some kind of skill that you've acquired. So it's a little bit different type of knowledge than direct awareness, or the last one, which is propositional knowledge. A lot of times propositional knowledge is what people think of when they think of knowledge, right? That's knowledge that can be expressed in a sentence, right? I believe fill in the blank, right, is true. And so that's propositional knowledge. And so these are three different types of knowledge just to keep in your mind as we kind of keep going, keep moving. All right, this is pretty foundational. This could be an entire lecture on this. This is comes out of work primarily sort of started by a fellow named Alvin Plantinga. Basically, we can know many things in a properly basic way, and by properly basic, I mean without having to know how we know them. So the justification for them, the warrant for them, is that they're properly basic. Okay? So what are some examples? Number one, a metaphysical truth. Okay? A metaphysical truth would be a truth about reality. I know that I had coffee this morning. That's an item of knowledge that I have. Okay? I could maybe give you some kind of historical evidence for that, or some kind of physical forensic evidence, like maybe it's still in my stomach or my system somehow, probably, but that's an item of knowledge, and I know that without having to prove how I know that. And that's because it's from my memory of my past. That's a metaphysical truth. Okay? I know that the external world is real. Like, this is real, this room. Now, again, we'll get back to this is all simulation or matrix thing later, but like, this is my experience of the external world is real. That's a metaphysical. I can't run an experiment to demonstrate that to you, but it's a truth that I hold. Moral truths. I think that we can clearly actually have direct awareness of moral values. Like, it is a moral good for a parent to care for a child and not torture them for their own pleasure. That's a moral good. And I don't care if someone has a different opinion about that. They're just wrong. In the same way that the person that thinks 2 + 2 is 5 is wrong. Okay? That is just that moral truth is the furniture of the universe. It's just there. And I know that. There are certain moral truths. Logical truths. So this would be like, different laws of logic, the law of identity, the law, like something is A and something can't be A and not A at the same time. That is a logical truth. I have direct awareness of that logical truth. In the same way, I have the same direct awareness of mathematical truths. These are all properly basic to me. As I said, truths by, like when I said the chair, I see green on this chair. That I know that in a properly basic way. I don't have this listed here, but another type of direct awareness would be I have awareness of my own conscious states. I know that I'm thinking about my notes for this lecture right now. Like, that is, I have an internal conscious state of that. I know that, and I'm directly aware of that in a properly basic way. I don't have an argument I can give you for that, right? Certain religious truths, not all, but certain ones. In particular, Plantinga argues that one can have the knowledge of God in a properly basic way. And I know this to be true from experience just like in my immediate family. Maybe you know some people like this. My grandmother, I have one grandmother that's still living. She's in her 90s. She's a sweet lady, but she couldn't give you a single argument for God's existence if her life depended on it. But she knows God. She has an experience of God. She knows that there is a God. And how does she know that? She knows it in a properly basic way, in that she has an internal experience of God. Now, there's a difference between knowing that God exists and showing that he exists, right? Showing it to someone else. But my granny knows, and she knows it in a properly basic way. She doesn't, for her, she has justification in her belief because it's an internal awareness of God, even though she may not be able to give a syllogism or something for an argument for God. Okay, so let's jump into, and now that we've kind of defined some terms, we've talked about knowledge, we've talked about some ways that we know things. I want to start now diving into problems with other theories of knowledge. So specifically those two that we talked about, the other two that we talked about, that postmodern relativistic approach to truth, and then which I think is the most dominant, that if you bumped into somebody on campus, you're probably going to bump into that one, if I had to guess. If not, you might bump into something like scientism, and we'll talk about that briefly too. So some just high-level problems right out of the gate with moral relativism. That would be the view that obviously that moral knowledge in particular is relative. Okay, so we're limiting ourselves now to a discussion about moral knowledge right now, right? So number one, if relativism is true, then nobody can be accused of doing something wrong, right? That would be like saying, calling a foul in a game where there are no rules, right? It's like, wait, you can't do that play? Like, what do you mean? There's no rules, right? So you can't accuse anybody of doing something wrong if this is true. On this view, accountability of any kind or punishment makes zero sense. Relativists can't place blame, or more, I think maybe sometimes more importantly, they can't also accept praise or praise someone else. There is nothing that's morally praiseworthy or honorable in this system. Nothing is. If relativism is true, you can never improve your morality. That means there's no place for a moral reformer in any way. Reforming, like improving towards what? What standard are we improving towards if relativism is true? There is no standard. If relativism is true, then you cannot promote virtues, including tolerance. Because that would be, to promote a virtue would be to say, you should, notice the borrowed language from the objectivist, you should. What do you mean, I should? Shoulds and oughts don't exist in this framework. There are no shoulds and oughts, right? And if you're talking to someone who is that claims to be a moral relativist, look for the shoulds and oughts. Because you can say those words, but you can't live them. That's the last one. Relativism is completely unlivable. You cannot live this way. The relativist doesn't want others to be relative towards them, right? They want to say that things are relative, but they don't want to experience the world as if they're being treated in a relativistic way, right? So this is, on one hand, people, I think, will argue, like, hey, everything is subjective, everything is relative. Yes, sir?
Certainly still not going to work, but I was going to possibly propose maybe for, a justification for still punishing people or still praising others is like, sure, everyone's morality is relative, but a lot of people's morality is going to line up in similar ways.
Yeah.
And so, pretty much just putting it down to some kind of popular vote-esque sort of thing that, in a society you have a somewhat prevailing view of morality and then you base out praise and punishment based on that.
Yeah, that won't be actual praise and punishment. That'll be an arbitrary rule done by power.
Sure.
Right? So I would agree that could happen, but on this view, it won't be praiseworthy or morally wrong in any way. That's not what will make it, because there are no moral values on this view, right? If you're being consistent, right? So you could get a group of people together that could dominate other groups of people because we got enough people, and we could set our own arbitrary and impose that on other people. You could do that. But on this view, that wouldn't be punishing someone. That would be me enforcing my views on them out of a power dynamic, right? So I just want to make sure we're using our terms correctly. But yes, you could do that. But they're not. You're not actually accusing them of doing something wrong. You're saying you're violating the rule, that my subjective rule, or maybe our group subjective rule, and because of our power, we're going to enforce our will on you, right? All right. These are bad arguments for skepticism, and I call them bad arguments because they're not really arguments; they're really bad claims. And but you might run into them if you're dealing with somebody. So this is somebody that's skeptical about knowledge. They're skeptical, like they might be skeptical that there is knowledge, or they might be they might say, okay, maybe there is truth out there somewhere, but like you don't know it, I don't know it, right? Who are we to say, right? So they might be skeptical that there is truth, or they might be skeptical that you can know truth. Those are two slightly different things, okay? But I think these are bad arguments, but you'll bump into them. Obviously, the person that says there is no truth, I'm guessing we've run into that, or maybe that's been discussed here, like what is obviously wrong with this statement?
Is that true?
Right, it's a truth claim, right? So it's obviously self-defeating, right? So is it true that there is no truth, and now we've got a problem, right? So that doesn't get off the ground. This is a little different. I don't know if there is truth, okay? Okay, that might be a view that somebody has. I would probably say, hey, do you think that it's true that you know that you don't have truth or that you don't have knowledge? Is it true that you know that you don't know? Like, yeah, it's true that I don't know if I don't know. Is it true that you don't know that you don't know that you don't know? Right? And you can see that you have like this infinite regress. Like at some point, you're going to have to say, no, I do know. It is true that I know that I don't know if there is truth, right? That's at least an honest person, I think, that you could have a conversation with. Now, does it follow that because they don't know there is no truth, that there is not truth? Let me say that one more time. Does it follow that just because someone says, I don't know if there's truth, that therefore there is no truth? No, that's what's called a non sequitur. It doesn't lead, right? It doesn't go from A to B here. So it doesn't follow that just because you don't know that there's truth, that there isn't truth. You just might not be thinking well. You might not have read enough. You might not have considered arguments for truth. There's hundreds of reasons why you might not know. But that's really a comment more about your psychological state, not reality, right? Or where you are intellectually, possibly. Okay, the iterative skeptic. We've probably at least maybe bumped into this kind of a person if you've ever talked to anybody. It's like, oh yeah, well, how do you know? And you say something. Oh yeah, well, how do you know that? And you say something else. Well, yeah, well, how do you know? Like, okay, we got it. We're like we're like going around in circles here. It's just a how do you know, how do you know, how do you know? And I think I like how J.P. Moreland puts this, a Christian philosopher. He says, if you run into someone who's doing this, what they're really doing is they're actually not likely involved in the intellectual exchange. They're playing a game, is what they're doing. They're not actually truth-seeking. They're playing sort of this game. They're not really in the conversation. They're taking a posture towards the conversation. And so his advice is to say, hey, I've given you like a couple different answers. First you asked this and I gave you an answer, and then you said, how do you know? I gave you another answer. And we've kind of been doing this dance now for like 3, 4, 5 questions. And you just keep saying, how do you know, how do you know, how do you know? It seems to me like you're not actually taking this conversation seriously. And maybe I'm wrong. Could you give me, are you taking this seriously? Could you give me some reasons for why that is? And if they do say, oh, well, I am taking this serious because of such and such, such and such. Really, how do you know? Right? And you could play the game. It's like, okay, so this isn't like, let's actually deal with whatever the conversation is. This isn't an actual argument against knowledge. This is just a posture towards the conversation. So, okay, these are better arguments to be skeptical. I don't think they go through, but they're better than the last ones that I just showed you. So what's the first one? Okay, the first argument that's standard is from the fact of error. So the skeptic regarding knowledge might say something like, well, yeah, but haven't you been wrong before? Yeah, I've been wrong. I mean, I think everyone, if they're honest, will say, yeah, I've been wrong. So what strikes you here? Like what in this, if you say, hey, you make a truth claim of some kind, maybe you provide some justification for that truth claim, right? And they say, well, yeah, but I mean, haven't you been wrong? But how do you know that? Haven't you been wrong before? Or you've been wrong before, you don't know that, right? What's going on here with this argument? Does that go through? What's wrong with it? Like, how does that strike you? Any thoughts?
It just seems like a non sequitur to say that just because I was wrong before means I need to be radically skeptical about everything now.
Correct. That's exactly right. It doesn't follow that just because I have been wrong, that I am wrong now. I just gave you I'm just in this hypothetical situation, like let's say that we offered some justification or some warrant for this truth, for this knowledge that we claim to have, right? Like, I think I have good reason to think that I'm right. In fact, until you can show me some reason or how I've maybe not thought through this well or give me some counter defeater argument here, then I think I'm in my right to hold this as knowledge. And it doesn't follow that just because I have been wrong before that I am now, right? Let's say, well, it's possible that you're wrong. Right? So this is from the mere possibility, not of error. So it's possible, isn't it possible that you're wrong? So let's say you're having a conversation. I don't know. I don't know what all topics you guys have addressed this semester, but take a topic. Have y'all done anything like on God's existence or something? Usually Alan kind of starts on that sort of topic, right?
We started with the authorship of the Gospels.
Okay, so you make some claim about the authorship of the gospel based on some evidence or something that has been offered, right? Isn't it possible that you're wrong about that? Well, what's the answer?
Show me where I'm wrong.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's the follow-up. The quick answer is, yeah, it's possible that I'm wrong, but yeah, show me, like, where have I gone wrong here? And I'm open. I mean, if we're truth-seeking, we should be open to, like, yeah. I mean, let's dive into this. Like, shoot holes in my argument. Like, where have I gone wrong here, right? But just because I possibly could be wrong, doesn't mean that I am wrong, right? This is a little more technical. In order to know something, you have to know how it is that you know that. Okay? So that would be like, yeah, well, how do you know that is true? Right? And so sometimes in the literature it would be called Methodism, not to be confused with the Methodist Church, totally different. But Methodism means, like, in order to know something, you have to have a method by which you know that thing, right? Does anything strike you as being a little off or with this view, that in order to know something, I have to know how I know it? Not you. Well, definitely. That's a major problem, right? Like now, okay. So sometimes this is called the problem of the criterion, meaning like I have to have a criteria by which I know something, right? So it's like, okay, here's a truth claim. Okay, in order to know that, I need a criteria for how I know that. Okay, here's my criteria. Well, yeah, but now I need a criteria for my criteria, right? And you see the infinite turtles all the way down problem, right, of this infinite regress of criteria. This is why Methodism just cannot work. So so what we're really identifying here is the difference between the logical possibility of error versus the epistemological possibility, meaning or another easier way to say that would be, it's possible that I'm wrong, but the real question is, do I have a good reason to think that I'm wrong? Those are two different things, right? So if someone is skeptical about claim or about knowledge, that we don't have to disprove them so much as we have to show that their argument hasn't gone through here. The skeptical argument hasn't gone through. Because there's a claim that's been made, then you're met with a skeptical argument against knowledge. It's like, well, yeah, but just because I might be wrong, or I could be wrong, or I don't know how, I don't have a criterion for all of the things that I know, it doesn't mean that I don't have a good reason for thinking I'm wrong, or that I have a good reason to think I'm wrong. But maybe you can show me. Like he said, show me where I'm wrong, right? Okay. So briefly, we'll talk about this. So this is, if you can't prove it scientifically, you can't know it. I love this little cartoon. I don't know if you can read that back there, but it says, if it's not scientifically verifiable, then it's meaningless. Then it says, well, can you scientifically verify that? Right? So it's also very self-defeating, right? So verificationism died in academia because it couldn't meet its own standards, just pure and simple. So science, in particular, is suffuse with untestable assumptions. Mathematical assumptions, logical assumptions, metaphysical assumptions that I mentioned. This criteria for knowledge it can't meet its own standard, so it fails. Now, that's not to say that we're not saying there is no truth in science. That's not what we're saying. We're just saying you cannot limit knowledge to only science. Science doesn't give you, that's a tool from a different toolbox. Like the science is a great set of tools, and it's a way to find out about knowledge, but it's not the only way to find knowledge. That's the mistake of scientism and verificationism. Briefly, I'll give you just a quick overview of the evolutionary argument against naturalism. So also another fella, Alvin Plantinga, So and when you talk about epistemology, I mean, he transformed epistemology, he's probably one of the greatest philosophers in the last century. This argument has been around for a little while, but he really refined it. You can even find the infancy of this argument in C.S. Lewis as well. But basically, it's like, okay, if evolution is how you and I got here, it's also how our body parts got here, and it's also how all of our, if we're assuming naturalism, all of our faculties got here. Well, the problem is that truth is not always, selection doesn't always favor truth. Like an example that Alvin Plantinga uses is he's like, hey, like if someone believes that the best way to survive is to go and play with tigers, but the way that they do that is they hide from the tiger. They think, okay, the best way to do is I want to play games with tigers, and the way they do that is they go run and hide in a cave. That person is going to, that belief is going to propagate because it was selected for, but it might be a false belief. Like playing with tigers is not a good idea for survival, right? So evolution doesn't select for truth, it selects for survival. And so what that means is that basically if all we are is the sum of our physical parts and formed by a natural process, then how is it that we can trust our truth-seeking faculties, right, at all? In fact, another fellow that had a similar argument was this guy, Charles Darwin. With me, the horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of a man's mind, which has been developed from the mind of lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy. Would anyone trust in the convictions of a monkey's mind if there are any convictions in such a mind? So that's the seeds of the evolutionary argument against naturalism. In other words, if we do have knowledge and we are truth-seeking, remember we had 3 worldviews, so the scientific naturalism, they want to say, hey, there is truth. In fact, we've kind of sort of become strange bedfellows in culture with some of those, like even shifts with us, those new atheists, even with the Dawkins, or like Dawkins hates this whole postmodern, view of truth. So in some ways, like he's more aligned with the theist than he is with the postmodern culture, right? Because both theism and scientific naturalism affirm objective reality and truth. The scientific naturalist wants to say yes to truth and knowledge, but only in these areas, not in the areas of religious or moral knowledge, right? Because those are not testable. And so the theist says no, yes, in science and in these other areas, right? And then the postmodernist says, it's my show. It's whatever I come up with, I create my reality. Reality is what I define it. And so when you tell a postmodernist that they're wrong, that's why it's met with such vitriol, because you are literally attacking their reality. It's their self-constructed reality, right? And so we've got a conflict there. So we've looked at a couple things just to kind of overview. So we looked at the 3 worldviews. We looked at some definitions like what is truth, what is knowledge, what types of knowledge that we've got, right? We talked about some areas of properly basic knowledge that we can have without having justification for them. Now, if we're going to make a claim like, what was the topic, that the Gospels, something about the Gospel authors? If we're going to say, hey, Matthew wrote the Gospel of Matthew. Oh, yeah, that's a propositional claim, and that requires justification. So I don't know that in a properly basic way, right? I do need to have justification and warrant for that kind of a claim. Now, if I'm going to say, hey, you know what? I know that I'm in this room, that reality is real, the past is real, my knowledge, my memory, while fallible, is reliable. Like I know I had coffee for breakfast. If I'm going to say, hey, I know that there is a God, I have direct experience of a relationship with God. Now, that might not work for you in terms of like demonstrating to you that there is a God, but I'm justified in my belief, right? Because I have direct awareness, right? And so these are all areas of knowledge that we can know things. And so what do? We start with these particular things that we do know in a properly basic way. Sometimes this is actually called particularism. And then from there, or foundationalism, from there we build a foundation of knowledge. So we go and we assess, okay, based on these properly basic beliefs, I can move into the world now and I can assess other propositional beliefs and I can look for justification for those beliefs. So we do that whether we are we're not maybe intellectually aware that we're doing that, but that's what we're doing. Like, hey, do I think that's true? What you're doing is you're thinking through the justification that you have for that, right? Now, I said that I was going to be talking mostly to Christian brothers and sisters here, and one thing I do want to end on is this, kind of a challenge as we think about that worldview conflict and we engage those other worldviews. I think many people in the church are falling into this error. So Paul writes to Timothy, who was one of his disciples. He was a young man that studied under Paul, and so Paul's writing in 2 Timothy, he says, there's a time coming when people will not endure sound teaching, but having itching ears, they will accumulate for themselves teachers to suit their own passions, right? And they will turn away from listening to the truth, and they will wander off into myths. And it's that teachers to suit their own passions. I think that is the postmodernist approach. It is the cafeteria approach to reality. I'll take a little bit of that. No, I don't want that. I'll take a little bit of this. Yeah, I like that. Or I don't want that, right? And it's constructing their reality based on their own personal subjective feelings. Lastly, I think as we think about interacting with the culture, I think we don't want to be Pilate. So Pilate is wrestling with whether or not what he should do with Jesus. He doesn't think that Jesus is guilty. But what does he end up doing? Wanting to please the crowd, he released Barabbas to them. So what did he do? Even though he had these convictions, he had a desire to please the crowd. And I think we have to, as Christians, stand firm that there is knowledge, there is objective truth. We should draw a line in the sand and not cede that ground to please the crowd. And that might be met with some vitriol and some difficult conversations, but I think we have to do that. So, okay, I'm going to end it there. How am I doing on time? 8:06. Do we have a little bit of time? Are we good? Okay. Any questions on anything that we covered? Yes, sir.
For someone who follows has naturalism and wants to counter, say, like the evolutionary argument, could they say something along the lines of we assume certain things like the laws of logic, etc., that everyone, say, takes as axioms, and while we may not necessarily be able to trust ourselves, as long as we presuppose that we trust these laws and such, from there we can build up and ascertain true things about reality in some way?
I think so. Now, obviously, just because someone believes in evolution doesn't necessarily mean that they hold to that worldview of scientific naturalism. I want to put a little caveat there that obviously the scientific naturalist would say, hey, science is the place where we're going to find truth. So if we're going to move into areas like moral questions or religious questions, there is not truth there. That's the land of opinion, right? But I do think they're going to want to borrow, and I use the word borrow because you can't quantify the laws of logic in a lab. There's no test you can run for the laws of logic, right? So they do have to assume, like you said, these axioms, right? The starting point. Now, I think as theists, we could, if they're not a believer, then I think we could rightly say, how do you account for these non-physical laws of logic that you're describing, right? And so, same question for mathematical laws, right? So those have to be rooted somewhere. I don't know if I'm.
I guess the theist would say, like, we don't have to assume these are true, or we can discover them in the nature of God, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that, we discover mathematical and logical truths by that direct awareness that I was describing, right? Now, it's a different faculty, but it's the same step. It's like, I can see that that's green, okay? I can mentally see 2 + 2 = 4. Now, 2 + 2 = 4 is not, I didn't stumble over the number 2 walking in the building. It's not a physical thing, right? And so mathematical truths and logical truths aren't physical things, but they're part of the reality. And so, that's again back to that's an axiom of science that you have to begin with logic and math. It presupposes logic and math. Like, how are you going to do science without logic and math? You know, so these are non-physical entities that you have to presuppose to do science. So, yeah. So if someone is an atheist or they don't believe there is a God, I think they have an accounting problem. They're going to have a difficulty accounting for those axioms. But I think that anybody can know things and can discover truth. I mean, even the relativist doesn't. They may not claim it, but they internally affirm certain moral truths. They just don't. They want to pretend as if they're not subjective, right? They want to say something like, "Hey, tolerance is a virtue, and it's racism is evil, and Nazis are evil." I don't know, fill in the blank. It's a good, we should take care of the environment, or I mean, fill in the blank, whatever the pet issue is for that person, they're going to have not relativistic thoughts about it. They're going to have pretty objectivist thoughts. J.P. Moore, I've talked a lot about J.P. because he wrote a great book for this. If you want to follow up on studying epistemology, Philosophical Foundations for a Christian Worldview. It's a pretty thick one. It's a big book, but there's like giant section of that tome that's all about epistemology, what we've talked about tonight. And JP and Dr. Craig are the two authors of that book. He told a great story about how he was in a dorm room with a student that was saying he didn't believe, he thought everything was relative, morals were relative. And JP this was back when there were stereos. I mean, people don't have stereos anymore, but it was like this big piece of equipment. They weren't cheap back in the day. And he just said, "Okay," and he grabbed the stereo and walked out of the dorm room and stole a stereo. And the guy's like running down the hall, like, "Give me my stereo back." Like, "What are you talking about?" It's my view that I think stealing stereos is a good, right? You seem to think that that's wrong, right? And so it's like you can say that you're relativist, but you can't live that way. So I don't know if I answer your question about evolution or not, but okay, cool. Someone else, yes.
Yeah, you kind of like half answered this, but earlier when you talked about the flaws inherent to being a more relativist, couldn't you ascribe objective value to other people's actions based solely on your own morality?
Couldn't you ascribe? I mean, you could ascribe your opinions as a relativist. Yeah.
You could say someone else is objectively wrong based on your opinion.
No, you cannot. Not if you're being consistent with your relativism. You can't, because relativism is that there are no objective facts about morality.
But
So you
what
can't
if
say there. Now you could say.
the objective facts to be what you believe.
Well, yeah. I mean, you could say it's objectively true that you're violating my personal opinion.
But
I mean,
you believe your personal opinion to be the objective standard for everyone else to live up to.
Well, yeah, that wouldn't be a debate about whether or not morality was objective or not. It would be a debate about whether or not you're the proper foundation for objective moral values and duties, right? That's a set. Let me say that again, right? So it's not in that person's mind. There is an objective morality. It's theirs, and so we would have to have a conversation about: are you the sort of thing that could properly ground objective moral values and duties or not? Right? And so that's a slightly different viewpoint. But I do think they could say, "Hey, I have my own opinion and you're violating my opinion." I think that they could say that consistently. Right? They can't live that way, but they could say that. Yes, sir.
So, at the beginning of the talk, you defined knowledge as justified true belief.
Yes.
So, part of that is saying that it actually is true, that it actually does correspond to reality.
Yes. True belief. Yes.
But in the objections to knowledge, you mentioned the idea that you can have knowledge, but you could still answer the question of, what if you're wrong? As well, yeah, it's possible.
Possible.
So, but if you're wrong about something that you have knowledge on, it's no longer a true belief.
Well, yeah. So it would not be. It would be knowledge anymore.
Yeah.
Like if it could be demonstrated that I have a false belief, then I would have to go. Then I can't claim to have that as knowledge if I'm being intellectually honest, right?
But you could still be claiming that it is knowledge before you realize that it's wrong, and so
Yes. Yeah, so again, back to the possibility of error argument. I mean, there are some things that I'm certain about, but there are very few things. I mean, that I exist, that 2 + 2 = 4, like these kind of logical mathematical truths we've been talking about. I mean, I'm certain of those, because I can't even conceive of a way that they could be false, right? And so, but aside from those very few things, none of us knows anything with certainty. So I think we have to be open to the possibility of error, but it doesn't follow that because we could possibly be wrong that we are, right? And remember, knowledge is something that comes in degrees, right? And so I could be like, hey, I'm like 75% on this. Like, I'm pretty sure, but I'm not 100% sure, but I'm pretty sure. And here's my justification for that, right? And if I'm presented with a defeater, meaning like an argument counter to my belief, then that has to enter the calculus. Now I have to think through like, okay, is that a good argument? What does that do compared to my justification here? Like maybe that brings my belief, maybe I was like 85 and that brings it down to 75. Or maybe it's like, man, I got a lot of work. Maybe that's a heavy defeater. Maybe that pushes me below 50%, right? And I got some work to do on that one if I'm gonna hold this. Now, and this is, obviously I don't know that we think necessarily this way, but I think we probably, if we're really having a hard conversation about knowledge, I think this is the approach. This is the way philosophers would think about it. They're thinking about, some of this is what Bayesian calculus is built on, is weighing these different, assigning values to these different pieces of justification, right? So, did you have a follow-up?
But if you did like believe something and thought you had knowledge on it, then came across some defeater, realized you were wrong, would you say then that at that point you never had knowledge of that thing?
I just had a false belief, right? I thought that I had knowledge, but I had a false belief in that in this hypothetical scenario,
But it's
right?
just like, if it's true that like you don't have, if it's true that like you never really knew it back then how could you really? You might have knowledge, but how can you actually?
Well, no, I would say is that I thought that I had knowledge. I was just wrong, right? That I did think that I had, right?
Would it be more proper to say instead of I know, just I think I know?
I think on my definition of justification, I don't think that I need to say, like, I mean, that's sort of like saying like, okay, am I 100% sure that there is a God? I wouldn't say I'm 100%, but I'm like high 90s on that one. But I still don't pray, Our Father who probably art in heaven, right? And so I assent to that belief. I feel like I know that, right? Now, could there be some, 0.1 or some fraction of I'm not logically certain. And so, like I said, there's almost nothing in life that I can be logically certain about or epistemologically certain about, right? And so I don't need certainty. I just need a high degree of justification. And so, yeah, I think, I still think that's a good definition, that justified truth. So, like, another way to think about that, JP uses a cool analogy. He says, okay, imagine there's a guy who, he's a homeless bum, he's a drug addict, he's a drunk, he's out on the, he lives out on, in some parking lot somewhere, and he has formed the belief that anything he reads on the stall in the Walmart bathroom is true. And he goes to the restroom in the Walmart bathroom and sees on the wall, George Washington was the first president of the United States. And this guy has no clue. He doesn't even know what a president is. He's just like, the wall says it, I believe it, that settles it. And that's how he forms his beliefs. And then you have another fellow who is a historian that's looked at documents and looked at historical evidence and formed the justified belief that George Washington was the first president. Now, they both have the truth. Both of these people have the truth, but one of them has knowledge, right? One of them has the justification that has been developed under, again, if you recall, like proper mental faculty. There's a couple caveats there for what justification and warrant means. And so just because the homeless guy has a true belief, it doesn't mean he necessarily has knowledge. The historian has the true belief and he has justification, and so he has knowledge, right? So it's a twofold thing. So, all right, any other questions? Yes?
How would you define reality?
how would I define the way the world is? Reality is the way that the world is. Yeah. Yeah, and so I did mention the what if this is a simulation? What if we're in the matrix? Sort of a thing. And so I think that the problem with that view is that I have more justification that the reality around this room is real than I do for the alternative. So unless I could be given an argument for the simulation or for the matrix that could show me that my direct awareness of the reality is. So again, it's not is it logically possible that I'm in the matrix? It's do I have any good reason to think that I'm in the matrix? Like that's the question when it comes to epistemology. Not is it logically possible, but do we have good reasons for thinking? So we have to look at the reality is the way that the world is. So when we think about my thoughts corresponding to reality, I just mean my thoughts in my head, do my beliefs, or do they align with how the world really is? And if the answer is yes, then I have truth. Cool? Any other questions? All right. Thanks, guys. Anything else we need to talk about? Looks like y'all are going to Canes.
Yep, yeah, well, Canes after this. But
All right.
all right.
Thanks, guys.